The Man in the Middle. It was almost midnight. Sally Truitt had just gotten on the subway train at 50th Street after visiting her mother. "Don't worry," Sally had told her. "The subway is safe. There's always a policeman on duty." But that night she didn't see one. Except for her, the subway car was empty. At 42nd Street, 3 tough-looking men got on. 2 of them were holding up the third, who looked drunk. His head rolled from side to side, and his legs refused to work. When they got him seated between them, his head came to rest on one of his shoulders. Sally thought he was staring at her. She buried her head in a book and tried not to notice. At 28th Street, one of the men stood up. "Take it easy, Jim," he said to the man in the middle, and he got off. At 23rd Street, Jim's other friend stood up. "You'll be fine," he said, and he got off. Now the only ones left in the car were Jim and Sally. Just then the train went around a sharp curve, and Jim pitched onto the floor at Sally's feet. When she looked down at him, she saw a trickle of blood on the side of his head, and just above it, a bullet hole.
Harold. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months. Then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but, it was boring. All day the 2 men tended their cows. At night they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. "Let's make a doll the size of a man," he said. "It'd be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare away the birds." "It should look like Harold," Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's and tiny eyes like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick him or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, which they both were sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you better eat it, or else." Then the 2 men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," said Thomas, "and that'll be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in a corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside any more. Now and then the doll grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten inside Harold and were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imagination," Alfred replied. "We've been up here on this mountain too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night long, he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing. But when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told one another. "After all, what could a doll do?" They drew straws to see which one would go back. It was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked on toward the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He did not see him anywhere, but he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun.
The teeth. I was hurrying home in the dark when I saw a man walking toward me. "Do you know what time it is?" I asked. The man lit a match to look at his watch. "It is 8 o'clock, he said. Then he grinned at me. His teeth were 3 inches long. When I saw them, I ran. Soon I came to another man. "Why are you running?" the man asked. "I just met a man with teeth this long," I said. "It scared me." "My teeth are longer than that," said the man, and he grinned at me. When I saw his teeth, I ran. Soon I came to another man. "Why are you running?" he asked me. "I just saw a man with teeth this long," I said. "That's nothing," said the man. "Did you ever see teeth this long?" I took one look, and I ran all the way home.
Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the light?
Jenny was in her first year of college. She shared a room with her roommate, Valerie, and they were really good friends. One night, Jenny asked Valerie if she wanted to go out and party with her and Jenny's boyfriend, Nick. "No," she said. "It's okay, I need to study for the big test tomorrow." "Suit yourself," said Jenny, and she left the room. She later met Nick at the bar nearby, and they had a great time. When the bar closed, they returned to Jenny's dorm. When they got there, they saw Valerie's shoes next to these big black boots. They also heard giggling, and all the lights were out. There was a curtain to separate the living room and Valerie's bedroom. Jenny and Nick decided they would leave Valerie and her mystery man alone for the night, and they would stay in the living room. So they did. The next morning the curtain was still up, but the black boots were gone. Jenny was the only one awake and making breakfast. She woke up Nick and brought him a glass of juice, but she tripped and the glass fell. Jenny thought she woke up Valerie. She called, "Val, are you awake?" But there was no answer. She called again. Still no answer. "Val, this isn't funny," she said. Jenny then got worried and pulled the curtain aside and screamed. Valerie was in her room, tied to her bed, with her throat cut open. There was blood everywhere, and in blood there was a note for Jenny and Nick saying,
"Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the light?"
The night it rained. It was late at night. I was driving past the cemetery when I saw a boy standing in the rain. "Do you want a ride home?" I asked. "Yes, please," he said. "I live on Front Street, next to the school." I handed him my old sweater. "It is cold tonight," I said, "and you are wet. You had better put this on." After that, we did not talk. When we stopped at his house, I said, "Keep the sweater. I will get it tomorrow. What is your name?" "Jim," he said. "Thanks for the ride." I stopped for the sweater the next day. A woman came to the door. "Is Jim at home?" I asked. "I have come to pick up my sweater." She looked at me in a strange way. "It must have been another boy," she said. "Jim is our son, but he has been dead for almost a year. He is buried in the cemetery." I told her how sorry I was, and I left. I did not know what to think. The next morning, I went to the cemetery. I wanted to see Jim's grave. Lying across the grave was my sweater.
Wonderful sausage! One dark, rainy Saturday afternoon, a fat and jolly butcher named Samuel Blunt had an argument over money with his wife, Eloise. Blunt lost his temper and killed Eloise. Then he ground her up into sausage meat and buried her bones under a big flat rock in the backyard. To keep the murder a secret, he told everyone she had moved away. Blunt mixed his new sausage meat with pork, then seasoned it with salt and pepper, added some sage and thyme and a bit of garlic. To give it a special flavor, he smoked it in his smokehouse for a while. He called it Blunt's Special Sausage. There was such a demand for this new sausage that Blunt bought the best hogs he could find and started raising his own pork. He also kept a sharp lookout for humans who might make a tasty sausage meat. One day, a nice, plump schoolteacher came into his shop. Blunt grabbed her and ground her up. Another time, Blunt's dentist came by. He was a little, round man, and into the grinder he went. Then one by one, the children in the neighborhood began to disappear, and so did their kittens and puppies. But no one ever dreamed that Blunt the butcher had anything to do with it.
Things went on that way for years. Then, one day, Blunt made a big mistake. A fat boy came into the butcher shop. Blunt grabbed him and started to drag him off to the sausage grinder. But the boy broke loose and ran out of the shop, and Blunt chased after him, waving a big butcher knife. When people saw this, they realized at once what had become of all the missing children and grown-ups and kittens and puppies. An angry crowd gathered at the butcher shop. No one knows for sure just what happened to Blunt that day. Some say he was fed to his hogs. Others say he was fed to his sausage grinder. But he was never seen again, and neither was his wonderful sausage meat. The bed by the window. The three old men shared a room at the nursing home. Their room had only one window, but for them it was the only link to the real world. Ted Conklin, who had been there the longest, had the bed next to the window. When Ted died, the man in the next bed, George Best, took his place, and the third man, Richard Green, took George's bed. Despite his illness, George was a cheerful man who spent his days describing the sights he could see from his bed: pretty girls, a policeman on horseback, a traffic jam, a pizza parlor, a fire station, and other scenes of life outside. Richard loved to listen to George, but the more George talked about the life outside, the more Richard wanted to see it for himself. Yet he knew that only when George died would he have his chance. He wanted to look out that window so badly that one day he decided to kill George. "He's going to die soon anyway," he told himself. "What difference would it make?" George had a bad heart. If he had an attack during the night and a nurse could not get to him right away, he had pills he could take. He kept them in a bottle on top of the cabinet between his bed and Richard's. All Richard had to do was knock the bottle to the floor where George could not reach it. A few nights later, George died, just as Richard had planned he would. And the next morning, Richard was moved to the bed by the window. Now he would see for himself all the things outside that George had described. After the nurses had left, Richard turned to the window and looked out. But all he could see was a blank brick wall.
The Red Spot. While Ruth slept, a spider crawled across her face. It stopped for several minutes on her left cheek, then went on its way. "What is that red spot on my cheek?" she asked her mother the next morning. "Looks like a spider bite," her mother said. "It'll go away, just don't scratch it." Soon the small red spot grew into a small red boil. "Look at it now," Ruth said. "It's getting bigger. It's sore." "That sometimes happens," her mother said. "It's coming to a head." In a few days the boil was even larger. "Look at it now," Ruth said. "It hurts, and it's ugly." "We'll have the doctor look at it," her mother said. "Maybe it's infected." But the doctor could not see Ruth until the next day. That night Ruth took a hot bath. As she soaked herself, the boil burst. Out poured a swarm of tiny spiders from the eggs their mother had laid in her cheek. Me-Tai Doty Walker. There was a haunted house where every night a bloody head fell down the chimney. At least that's what people said, so nobody would stay there overnight. Then a rich man offered $200 to whoever would do it. And this boy said he would try if he could have his dog with him. So it was all settled. The very next night, the boy went to the house with his dog. To make it more cheerful, he started a fire in the fireplace. Then he sat in front of the fire and waited, and his dog waited with him. For a while, nothing happened. But a little after midnight, he heard someone singing softly and sadly off in the woods. The singing sounded something like this. Me-Tai Doty Walker. It's just somebody singing, the boy told himself, but he was frightened. Then his dog answered the song. Softly and sadly it sang. Linchy, kinchy, kali, mali, dingo, dingo. The boy could not believe his ears. His dog had never uttered a word before. Then a few minutes later he heard the singing again. Now it was closer and louder, but the words were the same. Me-Tai Doty Walker. This time the boy tried to stop his dog from answering. He was afraid that whoever was singing would hear it and come after them. But his dog paid no attention, and again it sang, Linchy, kinchy, kali, mali, dingo, dingo. A half hour later, the boy heard the singing again. Now it was in the backyard, and the song was the same. Me-Tai Doty Walker. Again, the boy tried to keep his dog quiet, but the dog sang louder than ever. Linchy, kinchy, kali, mali, dingo, dingo. Soon the boy heard the singing again. Now it was coming down the chimney. Me-Tai Doty Walker. The dog sang right back. Linchy, kinchy, kali, mali, dingo, dingo. Suddenly, a bloody head fell out of the chimney. It missed the fire and landed right next to the dog. The dog took one look and fell over, dead from fright. The head turned and stared at the boy. Slowly, it opened its mouth and...